Hi everyone. Let's take this opportunity to do a mini case study. In the description section of the video, you will find some information. If you could go to that and follow what I'm reading from, we will proceed, okay? Let's say you walked into a job and you're buying $10 million worth of parts from a supplier. You walked into the job, and on a previous occasion, the buyer had a bunch of potential suppliers bid on the business, competitive bidding. The suppliers submitted RFQs to the buyer, and the buyer went with the perhaps low-cost producer. Okay? Typically in that situation, when you have suppliers bid on the business, if it's a true commodity and you have a ton of suppliers to choose from, you will also request a cost breakdown. So when they give you the price, you also want to know, where did all of these costs come from? Remember, let's keep it simple. There are basically three types of costs associated with buying something from a supplier. They have direct material costs. That's the stuff that goes directly into the part that they're building for you. They have direct labor costs. Those are the people that are actually building the part that you're going to be buying from the supplier. And then everything else is overhead. So again, three types of costs typically associated with a price and coming up with a price, and that's direct material costs, direct labor costs, and the amount of overhead that's going to be assigned to this business. And then, of course, the supplier is going to charge you a price above that amount. In other words, they want to make some money. They have margins. They want to make a profit on this business, okay? So let's say you've decided that you've walked into this job and you want to justify your existence, and your boss has told you that we need to generate a cost savings, and you're buying $10 million worth of stuff from this supplier in particular, and you feel like you're paying too much from that supplier. Maybe you've been buying this stuff for 3 years and you've been paying the same price, and you don't think that's right, because as you give them more and more business over a longer period of time, they should be generating economies of scale and learning effects and figure out how to do that business with you better, faster, and cheaper. So you walk in there and it's 3 years into the contract, and you look and you see that you've been paying the same amount for 3 years. So you want a lower price, but you're not sure what that price should be. And maybe you've got some options here. One option would be you could reopen the contract and have the supplier rebid on the business. In other words, put the supplier through the competitive bidding process again and have them submit an RFQ along with several other qualified suppliers. I will say, if you walk into a job and you reopen a contract and you have a supplier rebid on the business by competitively bidding against other potential suppliers, all you've done in that situation is, if you finally agree to a lower price and it's with the same supplier, which is usually and often the case, all you've done is hack away at their margins. And if you've hacked away at their margins, you've also lowered their ROI, and you probably haven't actually saved yourself too much money if all you've done is hack away at their margins. The point I'm trying to make is, anytime you're buying something from someone, usually most of the costs are direct costs. In other words, direct material and direct labor. So one of the most effective ways to reduce the amount that you pay for something is to work with your suppliers and help them reduce their direct costs and maybe not mess with their margins. So for example, maybe you could help all of your suppliers by buying their raw material for them and selling that raw material to them at a reduced cost, because you can buy it in bulk, whereas your smaller suppliers might not be able to. John Deere does that in that situation. So let's look to the example in the description section, and what this is basically saying is, this is the cost breakdown that you received from the supplier a couple of years ago. Okay, the supplier is basically saying the direct material costs associated with this part, making it and selling it to you per part, is $8. The direct labor costs associated with this part is $8 also. And then the supplier wants to attach a certain amount of overhead to this business, because someone has to pay for their overhead, and that would be their customers. So the accountant said, take 150% of your labor and add that in there as fixed overhead. So in this situation, accounting 101 terms, the RFQ and the supplier and the cost breakdown is saying the prime cost for you as a customer is going to be $28. Then I'm also going to attach some of my general and administrative overhead, which is going to be 10% of my prime cost. And again, this is what the accountants are feeding the sales engineer at this company, and in this case it'd be $2.80. So the supplier, when they submitted this RFQ with the cost breakdown, which you required for them to be considered for the business, the total cost is $30.80. And obviously, the supplier wants to make a little money, so they've said, I want a 10% margin on this business, which would be $3.08. So your price is going to be $33.88 per part. Okay, so nothing too complicated there. So my first question for you as students is, if you looked at this RFQ and you walked into the job, would anything on that RFQ and that cost breakdown right there look suspicious to you or be of concern to you? I'll give you a few seconds to think it over and look it over. Okay, I had one student tell me that, hey, isn't a double-digit profit margin like 10% or more excessive if this is a true commodity? For example, what if you're a buyer and your company doesn't make 10% margins on its products? Would it be fair for your suppliers to make 10% or more on the business they do with you in terms of profit margins? It depends. If you only have 2 or 3 suppliers to choose from, it's highly engineered, it's highly customized, they might be able to justify double-digit margins. But if it's not highly engineered, it's not highly customized, it's a true commodity, a lot of people could do it, all you're doing is handing them a blueprint, etc., then yeah, a double-digit margin might be excessive. So I had one student say, yeah, if it's a true commodity, why are they making 10% on this business? And I said, you know what, that kind of makes sense, I agree with you. And then I had another student say, hey, wait a second, it's 2020, and you told us in class in American manufacturing, when someone builds something and sells it for $1, the vast majority of the costs are in direct material purchases. So again, when you buy a car for $10,000, 60, 70, 80% of that is in direct material purchases and costs alone by the company that built that car for you. So if you look at this example, most of the costs in this cost breakdown are in overhead and not direct costs and not direct material and direct labor costs. So you could say, wait a second, why do you have so much overhead? It's 2020, typically in manufacturing, if you're a big fat company with tons of overhead, you're no longer in business. So some of these suspicious things in this cost breakdown are the double-digit profit margins. Hey, is it really a commodity? And if it is, why are they making double digits on our business? And then also, why do you have so much overhead? Do you have a lot of fat? Shouldn't most of your costs be in direct costs and specifically direct material costs? So some of the things to look out for when you look at a cost breakdown. All right, so you walk into this job and you buy $10 million worth of stuff from this supplier at $33.88 per part. So if you go to option 1 in the description section, one option you have, and this is what a lot of companies do, is they'll simply reopen the contracts and have the supplier rebid on the business. Remember, in option 1, if you have them rebid on the business, you don't work with them to help them reduce their costs. The cost structure and everything in the cost breakdown stays the same, other than you've taken their margins down from 10% to say 7.5%. Okay? So in this example, their direct material cost per part is still $8. Their direct labor cost per part is still $8. The fixed overhead, which is 150% of labor, is still $12. Their prime cost hasn't changed. The general administrative overhead is still 10% of the prime cost, which is $2.80. So the supplier is basically saying, my cost is still $30.80, but I've agreed to $33.11 as my final price. So their profit's only going to be $2.31 versus the $3.08 they were originally making. So in this example, what you've done is basically by taking the price from $33.88 to $33.11, you've generated a 2.27% cost reduction for you and your company. Now, on the surface, this sounds kind of impressive. In other words, if I'm buying $10 million worth of stuff from the supplier, and in one day I take the price down from $33.88 to $33.11, I've generated a 2.2% cost savings for my company, and on $10 million in purchases, that's a $227,000 cost savings. Not bad, right? You go into your boss's office and you say on the first day, at the end of the day, yep, I took that $10 million in spend, I drove it down 2.27%. Your boss says, how much of a cost savings is that? $227,000. That's the same thing as giving your company $227K in pre-tax profit. Not bad for a person that's starting off at $70K a year. You've justified your existence, what, 3 to 4 times over already on the first day alone? But again, from the supplier's perspective, yeah, thank you, customer. You've hacked away at my margins. And remember, return on investment is profit margin times asset turnover rate. You've hurt their ROI. You've made them a lesser supplier. You've made them less competitive. Okay? In most purchase orders, a contract between a buyer and supplier have something built into the terms and conditions that basically say you as a customer can reopen the contract anytime you want for competitive reasons and issues like you think you're paying too much. So that's one option. You can reopen it, have them rebid on it, hack away at their margins, and generate huge cost savings for your company, especially if it's on business that has a lot of spend associated with it, like millions of dollars worth of parts, for example. All right, so that's one quick option. The other thing I wanted to say with reopening the contract and having suppliers bid on the business is data shows that when you do that, the vast majority of the time, the supplier that originally had the business continues to get the business. They've simply agreed to a lower price. In other words, you've hacked away at their margin. So the other question becomes, why weren't you getting that best price to begin with? Why weren't they agreeing to a lower price during the contract, for example? You walked in there and you've been paying $33.88 for 3 years. Now they agree to $33.11. Why don't they come back and say, we can charge you less than $33.88 as a reward for giving us the business longer term? Or why didn't they come in at below $33.88 when they bid on the business the first time? So again, my logic is that when you have suppliers bid on the business, an important part of getting the best price is making sure that they're giving you the best price. And if you put them through several rounds of the competitive bidding process and they pad their quotes, chances are when it's all said and done, you didn't get the supplier's best price. One way around that is to tell suppliers when they bid on the business, it's a one-shot deal. They're only going to have one chance, and maybe they'll come in at their best price possible. So in this case, maybe they would have come in closer to $33.11 than the $33.88 that this previous buyer agreed to a couple of years ago. All right, so in option 2, if you go to that section, let's say you send in your engineers and value analysis team and you look at your supplier's facilities and how they use their labor and configure their machines and lay out their equipment, and you look at their manufacturing process. Let's say you spend several days there. Then you go back to corporate headquarters and you go back a couple of other times. And you tell that supplier, look, I want to keep doing business with you. You're a great supplier, but I can't keep paying you $33.88 every year. I want a cost savings, and I want to help you get that cost savings, and I want to share it with you in what we pay per part from you. So you walk in there and you spend some time, and let's say you're able to reduce their direct labor costs by 25%. By reconfiguring workers, by training them, by introducing them to new technology, that sort of thing. Okay, so in this example, if you actually go in there and you help them reduce their direct labor costs by 25%, and you tell them, look, I'm not going to mess with your margins, you keep your 10% margin. I just know as a buyer, if I can help you reduce your direct costs, that is going to save me way more money than simply getting you to agree to a lower price. In other words, me hacking away at your margins. So in this example, the direct material costs haven't changed per part. It's still $8. But the direct labor costs have been reduced by 25%, so it goes from $8 to $6. And remember, fixed overhead is a percentage of labor costs, so that drops down to $9. So quite often when overhead is allocated to business, it's usually based on a percentage of the direct cost. So not only do you reduce the direct cost for the supplier, but you also reduce the amount of overhead that's being assigned to this business. So in this example, the prime cost drops down to $23. The general administrative overhead, which is a percentage of the prime cost, also drops down to $230. So your total cost goes from, let me look at what it was in the original example, from $30.80 total cost to $25.30. And then you tell the supplier, hey, look, you keep your double-digit margin. You probably wouldn't be okay with that, especially if it was a true commodity, but just as a point of example. The point being, help suppliers reduce their direct costs. Try not to mess with their margins by putting through the competitive bidding process, especially if it's a good supplier that you like doing business with. So you tell them, keep your 10% margin. 10% of $25.30 is $2.53. So the supplier comes back and says, okay, the new price is $27.83. versus 33.88 or 33.11 when you just hack away at their margins. And the new price at $27.83 generates a 17.86% cost reduction. So on $10 million in spend, you've just saved your company $1.786 million. That's even better than when you put them through the competitive bidding process and you got it down to 33.11 and you didn't even mess with their margins. If anything, you've made them more competitive because now they have more resources to invest in more business with you, which might help them drive their costs down even more. So again, the moral of the story as you look at the original RFQ and cost breakdown is identify how much overhead is associated with this business. If it's over half the price, then they probably have a lot of overhead, are big and fat, and aren't especially competitive. And in 2020, you're typically not going to find that. Try to look at their margins and figure out for what you're buying from them, is that practical and does that make sense? And for true commodities, double-digit margins typically are not practical. Okay? In the auto industry, when GM, Ford, Chrysler sell a car, their margins are still single digits. It's like 5, 6, 7, 8, 9% on the dollar. So why would you have a supplier making 10, 20, 30% on the dollar when they do business with you? Well, again, it depends on what they're doing for you. If it's a true commodity, double-digit margins are probably not reasonable. And they probably wouldn't expect it. But if they could get away with it, they probably would, right? All right, so again, in this example, if you use the competitive bidding process, you don't do anything to help them reduce their direct costs. All you're doing is hacking away at their margins. The most effective way to generate a cost savings for you in what you buy from suppliers to help your suppliers reduce their direct costs, and usually in particular their direct material costs, because that's where most of their costs are coming from. So that delivers the biggest bang for the buck, if you will. So the problem with helping them reduce their direct costs is typically that requires time and effort. You have to be strategic, you have to make an investment, but when it's all said and done, the cost savings tends to be significantly more. What I've noticed in reality is when companies do this, when business is good and their margins are good, they're a little more patient and they think more long term. They work with suppliers, they're more strategic, they spend time at their facilities. But when times are tight, when we're in recessions and margins are getting thinner and sales are down, there's a greater sense of urgency, and that's when you're more prone to reopening the business, have them rebid on the contract and hack away at their margins. So there are short-term solutions and long-term solutions, and it typically depends on the economic climate. Okay, I hope that was helpful. We've talked about a lot of this before, but I want to put some visuals in front of you of real life examples of things that you'll be looking at and working your way through. And again, getting here requires a lot of soft skills, and that's why companies are paying a premium for you. What we just described here, none of this is especially tactical. It tends to be strategic in nature, and any decisions that you make tend to impact the company years down the road. Okay, thank you, and I will talk to you.